It's the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams, producer and host. This is the podcast where we talk about birds, bird nerds, all the people trying to do something about preserving birds, and the ever-growing and seemingly never-ending problems that confront them in their quest to continue to exist. And of course, what we're about is not thinking about doing something, getting off your butt and actually doing something. It's May 8th, World Migratory Bird Day. And to mark that occasion, I wanted to focus on two migratory species that have captured the hearts of a city and are important in two different places at other sides of the globe. It's my pleasure to speak with Mr. Terry Townsend, the energy, the driving force behind birding in Beijing, and somebody who certainly does take action. Terry, thank you for joining me on the Bird Emergency.
You're very welcome. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
I've been really keen to broaden the sort of focus. Obviously, in a new podcast, in a new venture, you sort of go with what you know. So we've been very Aussie focused, even though there's quite a few issues coming up where I've spoken to people internationally. But China's a kingpin, no matter which way you look at it, in birds, in all of the conservation matters for birds in so many regions, because so many migratory birds either pass through there or, well, they're heading to Australia, New Zealand, they're going to Africa, they're going to Europe. How did you get sort of the bird bug?
How did I get the bird bug? Well, that goes back a long way, I have to say, because I think my earliest memory of being interested in birds is when I was about 4 years old. So I was born and brought up in a rural village in Norfolk, in England, right by the coast. Small village called Winterton-on-Sea. And I remember, looking out of the back window of my parents' house and seeing birds in the garden and asking my parents what they were. And they had no real knowledge of birds. So they bought me a book, and I just started to teach myself about the different birds that were visiting the garden. And I was very fortunate that I was raised close to a nature reserve. So we not only had the ocean just next door, but also a dunes nature reserve just a few minutes walk away. And that really sparked my interest further. And it just went from there. So, yeah, it's odd because there's nobody in my family is interested. I didn't meet another birder until I was well into my teens. So it was a bit of a lonely pursuit, I have to say, and I thought I was a bit weird. But yeah, it came from somewhere, not sure where.
Well, I don't think that's a unique experience for birders of a certain age. I was certainly the only kid lugging bird books around in their backpack in my teenage years. Terry, you've been in Beijing for about 10 years, I think. Is it
That's
longer
correct.
than that?
It's just over 10 years. Yeah. 10th anniversary, end of August.
How did you end up? What was the journey from the seaside in Kent all the way to a decade-long stay in Beijing?
Yeah, how long have you got? It's quite a long story. But to cut it short, I mean, essentially before I came to Beijing, I was actually living in Copenhagen in Denmark and working for an NGO on environmental law, international environmental law. And we were working with legislators from many different countries, including China. And we were running a process at that time looking at climate change legislation. And we used to every year produce a report about the climate change related laws in the major economies. And at one of our meetings, the Chinese delegation said that we're going to start developing a general law on climate change, which at that time was huge news that a country of China's size was considering developing climate change law. And they invited my NGO to input to that process because we had a lot of knowledge about what other countries had done, what worked, what didn't work, and what might be applicable in China. So, and I was leading that process at the time, so it made sense for me to be the one who came and supported that effort. So I came to Beijing at just a few weeks' notice and worked with the National People's Congress and the National Development Reform Commission to inform the development of their draft law. And initially it was for a year, which turned into 2 years. And then after 2 years, the NGO that I was working for lost its funding overnight because they were working with members of parliament. And you may remember a few years ago, there was a big scandal in the UK about members of parliament expenses. And suddenly the UK government and European governments, who provided quite a significant amount of funding to the NGO that I was working for, suddenly got nervous about funding MPs to go overseas for meetings. So literally overnight, we lost a lot of funding, which meant that the NGO became unviable. So I was sort of stuck in Beijing, just lost my job. And it was like, well, okay, what do I do next? Do I go back to the UK and get another job, or should I try and make a go of it in China? And I'd really enjoyed my 2 years in China. I loved the people. I loved the places. Amazing country. So it's vast and has some fantastic wild places, unique wildlife, lots of unique birds. And I just thought, okay, let's try and make a go of it. So I sort of set myself up as a independent consultant, initially working on climate change legislation with the Chinese government and with other organizations. And it's just developed from there, really. So now I focus most of my time on wildlife conservation. And I've just been very fortunate to find opportunities that enable me to stay here and to work here. And obviously, given the size of China, the things you do here can make a difference, make a big difference. So just a small change, given the scale of China, can make a big difference. So I've been extremely fortunate to have opportunities that have allowed me to grow what I do here. And now I'm 10 years later, I feel very settled here and love what I'm doing. So I feel very lucky.
I was really pleased to get the opportunity to speak to you, because when you're sitting in a country like Australia that has a government that is on one hand reliant on China in the trade sphere, but on the other hand having this continual joust with the Communist Party. And we now have a situation where our journalists have fled the country and we're being, as tourists, warned against going there. It's really easy to join in the sort of Cold War mentality and hear about Western countries justifying their complete inaction or inability to move forward with any sensible climate policy and energy policies. They blame everything on China and India. It's always China and India haven't done this, so why should we? But it seems to me that China has taken the preservation of its own natural environment in the last 5, maybe stretching out to 10 years, really seriously. Now, you've been there. Is that a fair assumption? Are they really making steps to preserve what they've got?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long answer and it's a short answer. I mean, what I would say is that certainly over the last few decades, China has experienced astounding economic growth. That has come at an environmental cost. So we all know about the problems that China has had with air pollution, for example. That's probably the most visible example. And that was the sort of most obvious symptom or price, that was paid in terms of China's breakneck growth for so long. But I think what you've seen in the last 5 years in particular is a real recognition that this cannot continue. The way that they'd grown previously couldn't continue. And this sort of growth at all costs approach was no longer appropriate. And I think, this is common around the world. Once people reach a certain level of, the environment becomes more important. And, particularly for the middle classes, who live in the cities like Beijing, they needed to do something to improve the environment. Otherwise, they're going to lose their best talent. They're going to also have high costs in terms of health, days lost at work and things like that. So the last few years, there's been a big effort to tackle air pollution. And I mean, it's so much better now than it was 5, 10 years ago. The number of days where the pollution requires you to wear a mask, I could count on the fingers of one hand, the last 12 months. So it's much better. And I think, this is part of a pattern too in terms of China's strategy. So President Xi has this vision of eco-civilization. People say, well, what does that mean? But at its basic sense, it's about harmony between the economy and the environment. And I think if you look at underneath the rhetoric, there are some serious policies that have been implemented over the last few years to demonstrate that this is not just top-level words. China's developing a national park system, which will be launched this year. They've been piloting national parks across the country. So this is sort of to preserve and celebrate China's most important natural heritage. And they've got amazing wildernesses on the Tibetan Plateau in a place called Sanjiangyuan, which is literally means the three river sources. So it's the source of the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, and the Mekong River. Three rivers that combined supply hundreds of millions of people in Asia with fresh water. That is a vast area. It's amazing wildlife: snow leopards, brown bears, and common leopards, wolves. It's amazing density of predators. And that area is now a pilot national park. It will be a formal national park later this year. They've got areas, obviously, in northeast China with the Amur tiger, deserts in Inner Mongolia. They've got really unique wildlife in temperate forests in Sichuan, in Yunnan, also in the southwest. So there's a big push to protect the most important natural heritage through the national park system. And there's been a lot of strengthening of laws and enforcement too. So the wildlife protection law, the environment protection law, both been strengthened. There's been a lot more resources put into enforcement. The Ministry of Environment has been elevated in terms of its seniority in government. And of course, for those interested in birds, probably you're all aware that recently sites in the Yellow Sea, which is a hugely important hub for migratory shorebirds, migrating from the Arctic to Australia, New Zealand and back, have been selected as nominated and approved as World Heritage Sites, with another bunch of sites due to be given that status in the next few years, and a ban on further reclamation of coastal wetlands. So all of these things, are really positive. And I think a few years ago, it's sort of almost turned from a situation of despair to one of hope. I mean, obviously, all of these things combined are not the answer. They're not the final answer. They're not going to protect everything. But it shows that there's an intent and a direction of travel that I think is very positive. So yeah, it's
good to hear that something positive is there and that it seems to be genuine. Time will tell. Hopefully China hasn't fallen completely under the spell of the PR wizards that operate in the West, so that here we can re-announce the same policy and the same nominated expenditure 4 or 5 times and still get a PR hit out of it every time. And then, but anyway.
There is a sort of a misconception that China has one political party, essentially, and therefore they don't have this politics that we see, obviously, in the West. But I mean, I think they do have politics within the Communist Party. There are different factions, there are different interests. We just don't see it played out in the media in the same way that we do in the West. So the same debates happen, the same interests, the coal lobby, the dirty energy lobby are very powerful. And these debates and policy discussions are happening internally exactly the same way, but we just don't see them played out in the media because they don't have to present to the public that this position is better and we want to win votes, because they don't obviously have to do that. It's played out behind closed doors.
Well, let's turn our attention specifically to birds for a few minutes. What are the iconic species that require protection in China? Now, I'll get you to talk more specifically about the Beijing Swift and the cuckoo, because I know there's specific programs for them. But are there a number of really imperiled endangered species in China?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one that's obviously very well known is the spoon-billed sandpiper, which is not a breeding bird in China. It actually breeds up in the northeast Siberia. But China is arguably the most important country for that bird because where they molt after breeding, and quite a high percentage of the population winters also in the China coast. And that's a critically endangered bird, which is down to just a few hundred individuals. So that's a really endangered species, and there's a lot of work going on along its flyway. So on the breeding grounds, there's a head starting program where they take the first clutch of eggs and rear them, allowing the wild pair to relay. And that has been a big success in terms of increasing the number of young that successfully fledge. And then there's been efforts in China, obviously, on the Yellow Sea to protect some of the key sites. And to just mention the World Heritage sites, two of the important sites for spoon-billed sandpiper have been given World Heritage status, which means they have real hard protection commitments in China to protect those sites. And then there's been a lot of work also in the wintering grounds, in South China and some of the Southeast Asian countries, in Myanmar, Cambodia, and places like Bangladesh, to deal with the threats that they face there, which includes trapping and habitat loss. So there's a big international effort right along the flyway to try to save the spoon-billed sandpiper. But there are many other species too. I mean, Chinese crested tern is another one that's really critically endangered and went missing for several decades and then was rediscovered breeding on tiny islands between the mainland and Taiwan. And there's been a big effort there, successful, to increase the population, but it's still nevertheless very low numbers. There's species like Bear's pochard, which is a critically endangered duck, whose population has crashed in the last few decades, and we don't really understand why necessarily. So there's a lot of work going on now with that species, which is great. There's Yancosta bunting, which is another often overlooked bird, small brown job, lives in Inner Mongolia, away from most people, doesn't get a lot of attention, but that species is in trouble. And I think there's one in particular that nobody's really focused on because we know so little about it, is the streaked reed warbler. So this is a little brown job that is seen occasionally on migration in the Beijing area, actually, and Hebei coast, not far from here. But nobody has found its breeding grounds. Nobody's ever recorded its song. And the only wintering ground that was known in the Philippines, the Candaba marshes, has been degraded to such an extent that it no longer occurs there. And I think the last sort of confirmed sighting was several years ago now. And so that bird, I think, is really in trouble. And the breeding grounds are thought to be in northeast China and southeast Russia, but nobody's found them yet. So if somebody wants to make a name for themselves, head up to northeast China next June and find the breeding grounds. And I, for one, will be buying them a drink.
Yeah, maybe don't go there if you're an Australian or an American or even a Brit at this stage. Maybe that's a great job for a British environmental biologist or an ornithologist. Sorry, a Chinese one. The programs for the cuckoo and the swift. Tell us about them and tell us why they're important.
Yeah, sure. The swift was what started it, really. So, as you know, the common swift is a species that it's a unique species in the sense that it spends almost its entire life in the air. It's perfectly adapted for life in the air, eats in the air, drinks in the air, sleeps in the air. And we have them in Europe, right? The range goes right from the UK in the west right to Beijing in the east. And we knew that the UK birds migrate to Africa, and there have been groups tracking them in Europe for several years. But nobody had ever tracked the birds in Beijing. And in Beijing, it's a very special bird, culturally significant, because it moved into the original city walls when they were built in the 1400s. Old Beijingers used to think that their ancestors came back as swifts. So there was this strong cultural connection over many centuries. And, of course, they love the old buildings in the old hutongs and the temples and so on. for nesting sites. They provide nice ledges and holes for them to nest on. And of course, in recent decades, Beijing has lost a lot of those buildings to be replaced by modern buildings with straight lines, no holes, and glass. So the population has been falling over many years. And so it actually started with a conversation. I went to a BirdLife International drinks reception in London. I happened to be back at Christmas, and I met a guy called Dick Newell, who is a big expert and swift conservationist. And he said, has anybody thought about tracking the swifts from Beijing? Could be, not only will we discover where they go, nobody had ever discovered before, but also it helped to raise awareness about this species. And I knew that the Beijing Birdwatching Society had been studying swifts at Summer Palace, which is an iconic location. And they'd been ringing them, putting metal rings on the legs, with a unique number. And over several years, they'd realized that these swifts are very loyal to nest sites. So they came back to the same place year after year. And they also learned roughly how long they live, about 7 years. But they never knew where they went when they left Beijing. So when I came back to Beijing, I had a chat with them and I said, look, would you be interested in working together to do a project to track them? We'd fund the geolocators, the technology, and we'd just piggyback off their project that they did every year where they caught some swifts at the Summer Palace, ringed them, weighed them, and so on. And they loved the idea. So the following May, there was a group of us at the Summer Palace, including Dick Newell and a couple of other colleagues. And we fitted 30 of these geolocators to swifts. And of course, swifts are small birds. They're very lightweight, so they can't take anything very heavy, including a transmitter. So these geolocators store the data. They don't transmit it. So you have to come back a year later and catch the same birds. But of course, we knew from the study that the Beijing Birdwatching Society that these birds are very loyal to the nest sites. So we knew we had a good chance of getting some of them. And the following year, we were able to trap 13. I think in 1 hour, we trapped 13 of those 30. And of course, we discovered that they migrate all the way to southern Africa, so South Africa and Namibia for the winter. And I think there were some people that suspected they would go to Africa rather than Southeast Asia, which might have been a more obvious place and closest place that would be easy for them to survive. But sure enough, they went to southern Africa. And I think one of the surprises was that actually after leaving Beijing, they actually head northwest and go north around the Himalayas instead of going south and across the Arabian Sea, which is so it's an incredible journey. I think they crossed something like 18 borders. And I think it's very likely from studies of European swifts that these birds make this journey and back again without landing at all. So they spend the whole of that time from end of July to the following April in the air, which is just an incredible story. Nature's full of incredible stories, inspiring stories. And I think, this really caught the attention of Beijingers. So once we had this result, we talked to the media, and it really got a lot of interest in Chinese media and also international media, which meant that probably millions of people that live in Beijing for the first time had this new respect for this swift bird that they're very familiar with, just had this completely new level of respect. And I think one of the unforeseen things from this project actually was that I often go to schools and talk to schools about it in Beijing, and one of the things we talk about is the swift. And when they hear that the population's going to hear about this amazing journey and their lifestyle, they say, what can we do to help? And so several schools got together and make nest boxes for swifts and put them up on their campus to provide new homes, which is wonderful. So we've got something like 10 schools now in Beijing doing that. But then one little girl, 8-year-old, put her hand up and said, okay, this is easy. We can make nest boxes. But why don't we write to the bosses of the building companies who make the new buildings and ask them to make them friendly for swifts? What a brilliant idea. So then 4 schools got together. They nominated a Swift ambassador each, and those 4 Swift ambassadors to the boss of the most famous building company in China. He's a very, very famous guy. And he said, come on. So they presented the story of it, the migration, the lifestyle, how the population's gone down, what the schools are doing to help. And collectively, they all asked him, can you help? And he stood up and was amazing. He said, I didn't know about this bird. we've been making buildings for 20 years to make people's lives better. Now I realize we should be making buildings not only for people, but also for wildlife. So he made 3 commitments. One was to make and put up 200 nest boxes on existing buildings, and to integrate the design of Swift nest sites into new buildings, and also to engage the building sector as a whole across China about making new buildings better for wildlife, which was an amazing result. Completely unintended impact of that Swift tracking project, which I found really inspiring. These young people just had this idea and they ran with it and had an incredible outcome.
Out of the mouths of babes, isn't that? Terry, I'll just mention that for anybody who has been unaware of the Beijing Swift and the journey, they need to have a look at your Twitter page and the Birding Beijing account. And your pinned tweet is the recordings from I guess the 2016 data, because it's a tweet from 2017. So it's the data of the journey from Beijing down into Africa. And actually they cover a lot of ground in Africa, don't they? And then that journey back where they go north of the Himalayas and settle back into the Summer Palace in Beijing. So I would recommend you look up Birding Beijing on Twitter and have a look at the pin tweet, because it's
that animation. I think it's 13 dots, coloured dots, and each one is a real Swift making that journey. That's the data from those.
Yeah, it's the log data that you've collected after you've caught them when they've returned back to the nesting site. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a lot more to say about Swifts, but I want to move on to the cuckoo.
Yeah. So the cuckoo has been, that was the follow-up. So how do we follow the Swift? And another bird that is pretty iconic across Eurasia, really, is the cuckoo. Everyone knows the call. And again, this is a bird that's quite common in Beijing in summer. It's fortunate that in East Asia it's still a common bird. And they're primarily a wetland bird in Beijing. They parasitize the oriental reed warblers. That's the main host species. And again, this is something that's been done in Europe. So the British Trust for Ornithology has been tracking cuckoos in Britain to try to understand a bit more about their decline, because there's been a huge decline in cuckoos in Britain. And in fact, on the first page of the definitive book about cuckoos by Nick Davis, who studied cuckoos all his life, and he's a great scientist, and I thoroughly recommend his book, Cheating by Nature. But on the first page of that, it says cuckoos from Europe go to Africa, and cuckoos from East Asia winter in Southeast Asia. And so that hadn't been proven. That was sort of more speculation. So we decided to do a project in Beijing with cuckoos. And the great thing about cuckoos is they're a bit heavier than swifts. So they can carry a slightly heavier backpack, as we call it, which includes a transmitter. So that means that we can follow them in near real time. And so we used that opportunity to work with schools. So we fitted 5 transmitters to cuckoos in Beijing. And we visited schools, and we asked the school children to name those cuckoos. And then they could follow them in near real time. We would put out the data on social media and on a special website. And the schools were fantastic. They came up with some amazing names. And perhaps the most famous one was called Flappy McFlapperson, who was named after
a ferry. The ferry. Yeah.
There was a boat.
And we had a similar thing in Sydney where they did a public naming competition and got ferry face.
Yeah. So there's a theme going there, right? So, and there are a few British students at this school, because this particular school was an international school. We worked with Chinese schools as well. So we had sort of a mixture of Chinese names and international names. Yeah, so Flappy McFlapperson, they put up each class nominated a name, and then they put them up for a vote in the assembly. And Flappy McFlapperson was the one that got the most. And she ended up, this was a female, and she ended up being a real star, because she went up to Inner Mongolia to breed. So when we caught her in Beijing, actually she was still migrating. She hadn't finished her migration, and she went up to the border of Inner Mongolia and Russia to breed. And then she made this incredible sea crossing to Africa. So we got to October, and the birds were all sort of in India, and they'd been there about a month, and we thought, okay, they're going to maybe winter in India. But of course, they were just waiting for the monsoon winds to change. And as soon as the winds changed and started to take the moist air from the Arabian Sea to East Africa instead of India, the winds were helpful. And also there was rain in East Africa. And cuckoo's favourite food are soft-bodied insects like caterpillars.
Yeah.
And they generally emerge just after rain. So it was perfect. And obviously it was perfect. They've adapted this migration over millions of years. So we shouldn't be surprised. When we see it, it all makes sense. But obviously before you see it, you can't necessarily join the dots. But that's true. They headed south with that, spent the winter in Mozambique, and then, of course, made the journey back. And it was incredible. The following summer, we went with a school to the place where we tagged the cuckoos in Beijing. And right in front of our eyes, we saw one of those birds fly across in front of us. And you could see the tag, the aerial. So this was almost exactly a year after we tagged the bird. There it was, back in exactly the same, within 100 meters of where we tagged it, which just shows incredible navigational skills. So that was a fantastic moment. And again, got great media coverage. And I think we were fortunate in the sense that the New York Times reporter in Beijing, his daughter went to one of the international schools who was involved in this project, and he was completely hooked. And so he wrote a piece on this cuckoo journey from Beijing to Africa, and it actually got onto the front page of the New York Times, which to have a migratory bird story on the front page of the New York Times was pretty incredible. Way beyond our expectations. So these birds have been fantastic ambassadors, for nature, and I think have really inspired a lot of people, not only in China but internationally, just to inspire them about nature.
Now, the internet played tricks on a bit of your answer there, Terry. So, could you just detail when the monsoon winds changed and the conditions in East Africa were ripe for the birds? Where did they go? I caught that they ended up in Mozambique, but all the bit in between we didn't quite catch.
Okay, so when they were in India, sort of during September, they were there for quite a while, and we thought at that point that they may be set to winter in India. But then the monsoon winds change. So what happens in the Arabian Sea is during the summer months, the winds come off the Arabian Sea to the east and northeast, bringing that moist air to India, where they have the rains. And then in the autumn, sort of end of September, those winds change 180 degrees, and suddenly the rain stops in India, and the rain starts in East Africa. So those winds turn 180 degrees, start blowing sort of west-southwest, and taking that moist air to East Africa. And that's the point where the rains start in East Africa. And then gradually over the next few months, those rains move slowly. So these birds were just literally waiting in India for that change to happen. So they were enjoying having the moist air in India because that was encouraging the emergence of caterpillars. And then when that rain stops, that's the point where the winds also change. So the winds start taking that moist air, point where they make the jump. So they leave one area that was great for them while it was being rained on, and they move to this area that is now being rained on, which becomes ideal for them. So it makes perfect sense. And so they crossed the Arabian Sea into Somalia, and down into Kenya, Tanzania, and ended up spending the winter in Mozambique before heading back. Those rains in the spring, they start to move north again, so the cuckoos follow that. And then the winds switch again, take the moist air to India, and that's the point where they cross again. So when you look at it, it makes perfect sense. But obviously beforehand, it's difficult to join those dots.
It raises that big conundrum again for us, that their migration is so dependent on regular weather patterns. They've evolved to follow regular weather patterns. So climate change is it's got to be unless they're able to change their behaviour rapidly. If the climate patterns change rapidly, well, that's an existential threat for them, without doubt, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a risk in the future if there is a change to these weather patterns, the monsoon patterns. So that will certainly affect cuckoos and probably many other birds as well. There are probably other birds that use this similar migration route. We know that Amur falcons take a very similar route too. So they also breed, in northeast China, southeast Russia, the Amur River area, and winter in southern Africa, and make that crossing of the Arabian Sea as well. Yeah, and there are probably other birds that do that we're not aware of as yet. So, yeah, certainly you're absolutely right. They're finely tuned to these weather patterns, and so if there are changes to those weather patterns, they could have serious impacts on these birds. Absolutely.
Well, that raises an obvious question for you too, Terry. You've involved schools with two of the iconic birds of Beijing. What's the next one?
What's next? Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, it obviously
ideas.
works. I mean, it's a formula that works in terms of getting attention to the plight of the bird. So your method of working with the schools is obviously working because you're getting the payoff in the mainstream media that is not just fleeting. It seems to be fairly consistent, and that an interest in the resident birds in the city of Beijing seems to be increasing. And I think you can take a bit of credit for that because you're continually active promoting what's there in the city, not only birds. I mean, you've got a much wider sort of remit than that, but obviously we're focusing on birds today. So I hope you are going to pick out another iconic species and do another project.
Well, just on that, I think one of the reasons why we did these projects was to raise awareness about birds in Beijing. Because just to tell you a quick story, when I first came to Beijing, so many people told me when they found out I was interested in watching birds, then why have you come to Beijing? There's no birds in Beijing. That was the most common response when people found out I was a bird watcher. But of course, the reality is very different. The reality is that we've recorded over 500 species in Beijing, which puts it right near the top of the table. Did some research recently on G20 countries, capital cities, and Beijing is number 2 behind Brasilia. Beijing is ahead of Washington, D.C., it's ahead of Canberra, it's ahead of London, it's ahead of Paris, Ottawa, all these major cities. And I think when you tell people that, 99 people out of 100 are shocked. They can't believe it. So there's a huge need for raising awareness about birds and the importance of Beijing to birds. And I think that's the first step. Once you get that knowledge, that then comes pride. People have a sense of pride about Beijing being so good for birds. And then comes the next step. Well, we want to protect that. We don't want to drop down that table, right? And we want to keep Beijing near the top. And we want to, once you know about something and you fall in love with it, like the swift and the cuckoo, we've seen that. People want to help them then. They want to make sure that the places they need are protected. And so it creates support for policies that are good for conservation. So I think it's hugely important, this public awareness raising. And in terms of what we're going to do next, well, we actually had a plan this year that was scuppered by COVID, but it won't be in Beijing, actually. It's going to be on the Tibetan Plateau. So on the Tibetan Plateau, we're at the place I mentioned earlier, the Sanjiang, this huge national park where they have snow leopards and bears and wolves. To celebrate the fact that it's becoming a national park, what we were planning to do actually was to tag some cuckoos there. Because one of the interesting things is that if you follow the migration of the Beijing cuckoos and the Mongolian cuckoos also, they go out of their way to avoid the mountains. They take a look around the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. And yet, if you go to the Tibetan Plateau in summer, 4,000 meters above sea level, there are lots of cuckoos. So there's a different subspecies of cuckoo that lives on the plateau that is very poorly known. Now, we're pretty confident that it will go to Africa like the other cuckoos. But of course, we don't know that for sure. Yeah. So, but the plan is to celebrate sort of this becoming a national park, tag some cuckoos, work with the local people there, give them Tibetan names, and see where they go. And the idea would be that they would almost certainly pass through or winter in national parks in Africa. So this would link China's national parks with African national parks. And there's so much storytelling here in terms of some of these cuckoos would be mixing with snow leopards, and in winter they'll be mixing with lions and leopards and cheetahs, in Africa. And just think of all the cultures and the wildlife that we see on the way, on the migration. So this was going to be a sort of way of celebrating China's national parks becoming a thing, potentially twinning with some of Africa's national parks through migratory birds. And so that's a project that we really hope to do next year. We were not able to do it this year due to the COVID situation.
So you just need to find a cuckoo that's big enough to carry a GoPro.
Well, cameras are the next. I'm sure it's going to happen, right? We'll have the technology. I mean, technology is just moving at such a rate these days, and I think the brilliant thing about it is it's opening up this new era of discovery. We're able to use technology to make these amazing discoveries about some of the journeys of the migratory birds that it would be so difficult to discover without this tracking technology. And I think that's what's really exciting about today, right now, because these stories really inspire people and can really get people into nature. And I think when you look at the global situation of biodiversity loss, this is so important to reconnect people to nature and to get people to be inspired by nature, and hopefully build some momentum and support for policies that are going to stop this biodiversity loss, this catastrophic biodiversity loss that we're all experiencing.
Can we move on to birding in Beijing? Is there an active bird watching community in Beijing, and is it mostly expats involved in it, or is there a real sense of locals being involved and committed?
Well, I think there's been a huge change in 10 years. So, when I first came here, I would say that there are probably only half a dozen active bird watchers, and probably 3 or 4 of them would have been expats. Now it's completely different. I'd say 10 years ago, if I went birding, I would have more chance of seeing a first for Beijing than I would another birder. It was that low number in terms of people involved. But now it's transformed, especially the last 3 or 4 years. I think you go to any recognised birding site on any day of the week now, you will see other birders, and the majority of them will be Chinese. So we have a sort of a WeChat group about birding Beijing, which is like a sort of WhatsApp type system, and we have about 350, 400 members of that, and the vast majority are Chinese. And there's some brilliant young Chinese birders. And I think the interesting thing is the demographic. Certainly when I was growing up in Britain, it was 90% male, mostly older as well. In China, it's sort of 50-50, maybe even slightly higher numbers of ladies rather than men, and very young. And you get families going out birding together, which is fantastic to see. So it's quite an interesting difference in the demographic. But there has been a huge explosion in birding in Beijing, and I think in China as a whole also in the last few years. And I think that's also, that's sort of borne out in terms of the number of new records that we've had in Beijing in the last few years. So people are going out more, and they're finding more birds, more interesting birds. We're still finding breeding birds in Beijing, which is incredible, really. And when you think that Beijing is probably the most watched part of China, there's a lot of stuff still to discover, for sure. So it's an exciting place to bird. It really is.
How about the mainstream media environment for natural history kind of information? Like Britain's got the amazing natural history unit with the BBC, and here in Australia we've got still a fairly active sort of nature division in the ABC, obviously very similar with documentaries programs being churned out in the US. What's the situation turning on your TV or your streaming service in China? Are you going to see a lot of locally made, local wildlife focused programs, or is it nearly all re-edits of international shows?
Yeah, well, again, I think things are changing. So I think 10 years ago, the answer would have been it's mostly international programs that are edited and Chinese subtitles. But now it's overwhelmingly domestic-made wildlife programs, and there are more and more of them, on mainstream TV, on mainstream channels. So there's been a huge explosion in that, and I think part of it is that national parks focus on national parks. There's been a lot of programs about the development of national parks and focused on individual parks and wildlife within them. It's just such an easy topic, in China, because there's so much of it. There's so much wilderness still and so much wildlife, which is, I know it's different to the image that is often portrayed in the West, but you go to the Tibetan Plateau, it's just amazing abundance of wildlife. And the same as if you go into northeast China, into the forests there. I love going there in June. It's just amazing birdsong beyond anything I've ever experienced in Europe. So there's more and more wildlife TV now, domestically made, happening. So in the first few years I was here, there was some joint sort of ventures between Chinese TV and some of the established international groups like National Geographic and BBC and so on. But now they're doing a lot on their own. So it's definitely happening. And I think there's a big, this sort of reflects quite a big awakening among the Chinese population on environmental issues. And I think particularly among young people, there are NGOs sprouting up all over the country dedicated to wildlife and conservation issues. Some are dedicated to specific species like snow leopard or gibbons in Yunnan, for example, and others are more broad. But there's been a huge increase in the number of organisations locally working on these issues, and I think that's fantastic. I think there's still a way behind, starting from quite a low base if you look at 10 years ago, but I think the direction of travel is really positive. And I've been fortunate to work with some of these local NGOs, particularly Shanshui Conservation Centre, which is based at Peking University, and they focus on the Tibetan Plateau, and they're doing amazing work up there with the local communities on conservation and engaging the local communities in this work. And what I love about them is they're just so enthusiastic and energetic and positive. So it's, I can't really sort of overestimate the change that's happened in the last 5 or 10 years.
Well, again, it's really positive things to hear, and that's all we want, a positive step day after day, everything, every day. So another bit of good news being announced would be great. Now, I'm going to have to try and get you on again to speak about the regions in China, because there's a great untold story there, I think. Now, before we move on to the standard bird emergency questions for our guests so that we can place you on the spectrum, on the bird nerd spectrum, recently there's been a bit of controversy. I noticed it on Twitter with BirdLife International and China. Can you make sense of what's happened, and do you want to venture any kind of opinion or comment? Because I don't understand what's going on.
Well, I mean, I think anyone who watches China and what's happening in China will know that the Chinese mainland government, is increasingly strident in terms of how Taiwan is described. Taiwan is to the Chinese mainland a province, a sort of renegade province, if you like, that will come back to the motherland at some point. And of course, you've seen the pressure that has been put on diplomatically and commercially. So businesses that want to operate in mainland China, have to show that they respect the one China policy, as they call it, in terms of the mainland China's views. So this is not something that is new or unique to the conservation world. It's something that is a sort of political reality, if you like, that has been showing itself across the whole spectrum of economic activity and NGOs and everything. And that's the political reality. You have, on the one hand, China's view about Taiwan, and you have on the other hand, the international community's view of Taiwan. But increasingly, there are so few countries now that have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan because there's been so much pressure. And so if they have relations with China, you don't have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. It's a formal state. So it's a complex issue. It's a realpolitik issue. it's something that's not going to go away. It's something that's going to, I think, rumble on for a long time, until the situation is resolved one way or another. And I think until then, any organizations that engage with mainland China and Taiwan are going to face these issues. And so they have to make very, very difficult decisions based on their aims and objectives. And I think it's very easy to be critical of organizations that perhaps sacrifice Taiwan. But you have to look at the big picture, I think. And it's not about right or wrong here. It's about, if you want to have maximum impact in terms of, as a conservation organization, you have to work out where that maximum impact is. And if that means having to make some trade-offs, then, I think ultimately that's what's got to happen.
There's no negotiating. There's no negotiating with China. On this issue, there's no negotiating with the Communist Party.
No, they have a very strict view on this, and I think any organisation that works with China and Taiwan will.
Yeah,
and it's just. I don't think it's a bad reflection on any organisation, the decision they take, because the decision they take has to be based on their aims as an organisation and where they can have the most impact, and they've got to work with governments, whatever government is in power in the places where you need to work. And I think if you take too much of an idealistic view, then you're not going to be working in a lot of countries around the world that are very important.
There is the issue, I guess, of the people who have been working out of Taiwan. They need to be accommodated somewhere, though, don't they? They can't just be excommunicated from the official sort of bird/conservation community. They need the no, me either. But maybe they need. I mean, they have to be accommodated somewhere else, because they've obviously been doing work that must have been useful prior to now.
Well, my understanding is, BirdLife works with partners in partner organisations in different countries. So normally it's a local organisation in a given country or a given territory, however you want to describe them, and not necessarily BirdLife staff that are sent out around the world. It's more like partnerships.
I wasn't thinking they were staff. I'm thinking more the motivated individuals who all these organisations rely on. Without volunteers on the ground, there's very little internalization.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I would like to think that anyone who's working in conservation anywhere in the world wouldn't change their attitude to the fact that they're no longer a BirdLife partner. I mean, it wouldn't. I mean, if I was a BirdLife partner in Beijing and suddenly I'm not a BirdLife partner, it wouldn't stop me doing the conservation work. I'd absolutely continue to do it because that's what I've done. I'm in that world, right? So, I mean. Of course, it's unfortunate and nobody likes these situations, but I think without knowing the detail, it's difficult to comment more than that.
I think the only comment I'd be prepared to venture is that it's obvious who's going to win in any fight you come up against China. It's obvious who the winner is. So I think
there's an element of rail politics,
I think you just have to find the best accommodation that you can. Take account, as you said, of the real politic and move on. Now, quickly, because I know we're running up against something else that you've booked into. What is your favourite bird, Terry?
Very, very difficult question. I think if I was really pushed, I would probably say the house martin, because it's a bird that I grew up with. I used to nest on my house, my parents' house, and I used to just love the day when they arrived back from Africa every spring, and there's a magical moment, and I used to just spend many happy hours watching them around the house. So, and it's a bird that I still see occasionally in China. They're quite uncommon here. The northern house martin, which is the species that we get in the UK, is pretty rare in Beijing as a passage migrant. But I've been fortunate to see it once. So that would probably be my favourite bird.
So, did you have a mulberry tree in your childhood by any chance, Terry? No, I just thought if there are another thing that there's mulberry trees in Beijing, aren't there? So
maybe, but I don't know. I'm not a big tree person. I wouldn't necessarily recognise it.
I just thought it was a very nice British memory. Favourite place to go birding?
Favourite place to go birding, Beijing. absolutely. And if you push me to say a specific site, I'd pick two actually. One would be Lingshan, which is a mountain, Beijing's highest mountain, the west of the capital. It's about 2,300 meters peak, and I just love it in winter because it always produces surprises. So we occasionally get Tibetan plateau species occurring on this mountain in winter. Particularly the red starts, the beautiful Himalayan red starts, like Alishan red start and white-throated red start, both of which I've been lucky enough to see there. They really get my heart racing when I see them because they're always, it's rare and special. So that definitely is my favourite winter birding site. And then for a general birding site, I'd say the area around Yeyahu, which is Wild Duck Lake, and Ma Chang, which is right on the northwest border of Beijing. There's a reservoir there. It's a really fantastic place for migration. So spring and autumn, it's just awesome. And I'll be going there this weekend.
What's your greatest wish list bird? What's the one that you always want to catch a glimpse of?
Well, I mean, right now, I'd say the bird that I really want to see well and to photograph and to sound record is the street reedwalk, the one that I mentioned earlier about how rare it is and how it's slipping away really without any attention. And nobody's found the breeding grounds. I have had a look up in northeast China. I haven't had a comprehensive look. It's a huge area. It's a vast area. It would take years really to do it justice. And ideally you need teams of people going up at the right time of year, checking lots of different places. But that would be the one bird that I would so want to see and hear. It doesn't look much when you see it in a book, but to me that would be something special, to find a singing male on territory.
So I'm guessing the answer to this question might be linked, but where's your sort of bucket list, wish list place to go birding?
I would say I would love to spend more time in Xinjiang, in northwest China. It's a vast area, a huge province the size of France and Spain combined or something. And there's very few birders. I've been there once and just scratched the surface. There's a huge area to the west with a massive valley that goes into Kazakhstan. That area must be absolutely awesome for migration, particularly in autumn. But it's not an easy place to travel to, as I'm sure you're aware. So it's sort of it's top of my list, but I think it might not be realised for some time. But that's definitely the place I really want to go. I think if you want to find a first in China, that's probably you'd have the best chance.
Okay, well, leading up to the final question, which places you on the spectrum. No, there's three. What's your field guide of choice?
My field guide of choice for Beijing is the Birds of East Asia by Mark Brazil. It's by far the best field guide for this area.
Very good. No difficult choice there. That was an easy one for you. Okay. What's your favourite piece of equipment when you are out in the field and you can choose anything you like?
Binoculars. My 8x42 binoculars. Swarovskis, Tibets.
There we go. There's another plug, Mr. Swarovski, if you're listening. I'd love a sponsor. All right. Now, this is how we place you on the spectrum, Terry. When you're out birding, are you an obsessive list keeper? Are you ticking off relentlessly? Or is being out there amongst the birds with your sound recording equipment, which I will sneak in the last question on that, is an immersive experience, or are you a compulsive list keeper?
It's an immersive experience for me. It's all about the experience. I've sort of learned in recent years, really, to keep more records, and I certainly do that now, so I will keep a record of all the birds I see. But that doesn't come naturally to me. It's more the experience for me, absolutely.
Well, you're not at one of the extreme ends of the spectrum, so that's nice to hear. Now, Terry, you're the first person that I've interviewed, but there are more coming up, who are interested in sound recording of birds. So really probably for nobody else's interest but mine, what's your rig when you're out recording bird noises? And I'm going to say noises because it's not only the songs that you're after.
No, I guess the technical term is vocalizations. So I use a digital recorder, a Zoom H5 broader microphone, shotgun mic. It's pretty simple setup. It's not the best, it's not the worst. but it's good enough for me, and it's pretty portable, which is important to me as well. So I generally will take it with me wherever I go birding, just in case something is vocalizing unusually. And then I also have started doing something which is becoming popular in the US and Europe in particular, very little in Asia so far, is the nocturnal migration recording. So actually just recording at night, hours from the roof, to get a sense of the level and species diversity of birds that are flying over the apartment at night. And that's been it's a massive learning curve. Identifying everything but just getting a sense of the migration at night is really fascinating. And I think there's a lot to learn from that, not only in Asia, but I think in other places around the world. It just gives a new insight, a new dimension to birding.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
Definitely. Are you using a reflective dish as well?
I don't use a parabola, no. It's something I'm thinking about investing in at some point, but they're like everything, there are trade-offs.
That's
for
true.
me, it's the portability that's you're carrying it off your backpack because you're carrying too much stuff. So it's always a trade-off.
If you were further up one end of the spectrum, you'd have a parabola. But
yes,
good choice of a recorder. My portable recorder is one of the Zoom 6Ns, and I love it to bits. So,
I think I love capturing sound recordings now. The hope is that at some point I'll be able to have some sound recordings of pretty much every Beijing bird on the website.
Yeah, well, we haven't even really had time to talk about your website, which is well worth a look. Of course, I'll be linking to it, but I hope, Terry, that we can have a conversation again, maybe on another Megaphone Monday, and sort of talk more about the schools and then the regions, all the regional wildlife assets in China and some of the iconic species that are beyond the scope of the streets of Beijing. But
sure, yeah.
Yeah, I think everyone would love to learn more about China. I certainly would. Terry Townsend, we haven't even really talked about environmental law. So again, there's another whole subject to open up into. But thanks again for giving me so much of your evening after a busy day helping to save the wildlife of China.
It's a pleasure. So thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed the discussion, and let's hope we can do it again.
Well, we're going to. We're certainly. Thank you very much.
Great.